Today we're going to make some apple pear jack. Because our trees, apple and pear trees, were so prolific this year, I have lots of leftover fruit. And jacking is one of the things you can do when it's a little overly ripe to eat. Jacking fruit is one of the oldest forms of making alcohol, and it actually turns out pretty good. The recipe I'm using is from the Alaskan Bootlegger's Bible. I picked this up at my local brewer supply shop where I buy my supplies for brewing beer. And the single batch recipe calls for 8 pounds of apples. Of course, I'm going to use pears also. You can buy apples from the store, use whatever apples you have laying around, or most any kind of fruit you can use. Or you can just use a gallon of some sort of fruit juice. That works as well. You use 4 pounds of sugar. You can use brown sugar or cane sugar, a gallon of water, and a packet of champagne yeast. Because my fruit is so ripe, I'm going to half the amount of sugar, because I think the fruit has produced enough sugar, especially the pears. See there, don't even have to cut these up. I'm just going to mush them up. The apples are a little firmer still, so I'm going to use the apple core to chop those up, and then you can chop them up real fine, or you can put them in a food processor, however you want to do it. Basically, you just want to make a mash out of it. And then I'm going to use granulated sugar. I've tried using the brown sugar, but I think it makes it a little too sweet. And the champagne yeast, I just picked this up at my local brewer supply place as well. You don't have to add yeast to it at all. There's plenty of yeast in the air already, and it will ferment just using that yeast. It takes a lot longer, and the champagne yeast supposedly yields a higher alcohol content, so that's why I use that one. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to squish up the pears, and I'm going to cut up the apples and make them into a mash, and then we're going to boil some water and add the sugar, melt the sugar in the water, and we're going to put them in buckets, and we're going to prepare the yeast, let it start to wake up, and then we'll add that to the whole mixture. Then we'll cap it off the buckets and put them in a warm, dark place and let them ferment for a couple weeks. Alright, I finished up the pears, so now I'm going to work on the apples. I used to cut them all up with a knife, but I bought this handy dandy apple core. Makes life much easier. Now the apples are done, so I'm going to rinse them off in some cold water and then run them through the food processor and then add them to the pear mixture. Now I've ground up the apples in the food processor and added them to the pears. Next we'll go boil some water and dissolve the sugar in it. Alright, since we're making a double batch, I have 2 gallons of water in there. But because the fruit is so ripe, I'm only going to use half the amount of sugar, which is 4 pounds. Now the water's come to a boil, so I'm going to go ahead and add the sugar. Stir it up good so it dissolves. Alright, that looks pretty good. And we'll dump it right into our mash. Fogged up the lens. Mix it up. At this point we need to let the mash cool down some, because you don't want to add the yeast to it when it's too hot, otherwise you'll kill the yeast. So I have this handy dandy little thermometer with the probe on it, so I can stick it down in there, see how hot it is. See, it's looking pretty good. This is about right to add the yeast. The yeast activates at between 100 and 105 degrees, so I usually like to get it activated and then add it into the mash. So we'll go in and activate our yeast. To prepare the yeast, you use a quarter of a cup of water. Since we're doing a double batch, I have a half a cup of water. We put that in there and we heat it up to between 100 and 105 degrees, and then we'll add the yeast to it and that will activate it. If you don't get the water hot enough, then it won't activate the yeast, and if you get them too hot, then you kill the yeast, so you have to be careful. Once the water's heated up enough, I'll pour it right back in there. I think it's too hot, so we'll put that in there like that. See, it's at 130 degrees, that's too hot. So we need to wait for it to cool down a bit before we put the yeast in it. Alright, we're about 105 degrees, so we'll go ahead and add the yeast to the water. Stir it up. Also, make sure you check the date on the yeast, because it can die, which means it won't activate. So you don't want the yeast to be expired. Alright, so I'll mix that up and let it sit for a few minutes until it gets all good and foamy and bubbly, and then we'll add it to the mash. Alright, now the mash is about 125. I like to put the yeast in when it's like 120, 130, somewhere in there. The yeast is all bubbly and ready to go, so we'll just go ahead and add it in there. Stir it up. Now all that's really left is to put the lid on. This is a fermenting bucket that you can get from a beer brewing supply place. It's actually a 6-gallon bucket instead of a 5-gallon. The lid snaps on good and tight, has a hole in it, and then this is called a bubbler. So you put the bubbler in there, and then you fill it up halfway with water, and what that does is it allows the air to escape from the fermenter without allowing bugs and other things to get into the fermenter. So very handy to have, and that's what we'll do. Fill that up, and we'll put this in a warm dark place, and at some point I'll show you the fermenting process, how you know it's still fermenting, and we'll leave it for a couple weeks and we'll revisit it then. This is our jack that we prepared a couple days ago. The yeasties are doing their thing and breaking down the sugar and releasing gas. Once it stops bubbling this much, it usually takes a couple weeks. I'll rack off the liquid into a carboy and let it ferment for a couple more weeks. And it will still bubble, but not quite this much.